Hello, my name is Matuzo. I'm a front-end developer from Vienna, and in this series of videos I'm redesigning and building my website from scratch. In the last video I explained how I approach design and how and where I find inspiration offline and online. At some point in the video I mentioned that when I start designing I open the browser. I don't use tools like Photoshop or Sketch or Figma. I use Firefox because this is where I feel comfortable. This is where I have access to the tools that I use every day. And I can pretty quickly build something using CSS. This doesn't necessarily mean that I'm quicker in the browser than by using Photoshop, for example, but the result is completely different. If I design something in, let's say, Sketch, I can export it to JPEG or PDF or to an interactive click dummy where I can extract CSS and do all kinds of stuff, which is really cool, but it's still not the real deal. If I design something in the browser, I'm also already implementing it. And I can test it in other browsers and on different devices and different screen sizes. Designing in the browser helps me figure out how easy or difficult it is to build something and how long it takes to build. Let's have a look at my design. You can see here that I would say the most interesting thing here is this square shape. Usually a website only has a max width or multiple max widths, and the content on the y-axis has as much space as it needs. But in this design, I have a max width and a max height. And I'm wondering why there aren't too many square shapes in web design. Maybe because people don't like squares, I don't know. Or maybe it's just too hard to implement. Let's try it out. Whenever I want to test something, whenever I want to create a prototype, whenever I want to see if something works or not, I use CodePen. There are other websites as well, like JSBin or JSFiddle, or you can just use the editor of your choice and create a simple HTML document. But I like CodePen because everything is in one place and I can save it online and share it. And it's a great tool for creating fast prototypes. Now let's create a new pen. There are 3 columns. By default, they're aligned to the top, but I'm going to move them to the right here. And there's a column for HTML, one for CSS, and one for JavaScript. Since I'm not going to write JavaScript here, I will close the JavaScript column. All right, let's start by creating a div. You don't really have to care too much about the quality of your markup or your CSS when you're prototyping. Don't spend too much time thinking about semantics or selectors here. Now we have a div. Let's select this and I will set the height to 500 pixels and I'm using the same value for the width. And for easier debugging, let's add a border here and I will change the color to something nicer. Great. Now we have a square shape, nice and easy. Let's save this pen and change the view to debug mode. We have a square here, that's nice, that's great. If I make the viewport smaller, you can see that at some point we have overflow because I'm using absolute units here, I'm using pixels. So we need something more flexible. I will change this 500 pixel value to 50%. Okay, this is what we get. This is happening because by default the div has a width of 100%. 100% of its parent, the body. The body has a width of 100% and the HTML has a width of 100%. In this case, 100% of the viewport. But all of these items don't have a height of 100% by default. They're only as large as their contents. So if you want to use a percent value for a percent unit for the height value, you have to set the height of the parent element explicitly. If I select the HTML element and I set its height to 500 pixels and I select the body as well and I set its height to 500 pixels as well, or if I don't want to repeat myself, I could also use 100%. You can see that the square now has a height of about 250 pixels. This is great. Now we can use percent, but this is not a square. The problem with the percent value is that there is no relation between the width and the height. I can't use 50% of the height for the width. There is a hack. You might consider it. It's interesting. I'm not going to use it and I'm going to explain why, but let's see how this hack works. Instead of using a height of 50%, I'm using the padding top property and I'm setting it to 50%. And now we have a perfect square. This works because the percent value in the padding property is relative to the width of the element's parent. So if you set the padding property, it doesn't matter if it's padding top or padding bottom, padding left or right, to 100%, it's relative to the width of the parent element. So 50% here means 50% of the width of the parent element, in our example, the body. This looks nice, but if we add content, you can see that the content is at the very bottom of the element. Of course, because we have a very large padding value. In order to fix this, you have to wrap the content in a div and use absolute positioning to place it in the top left corner of the square. It works, it's okay, but it just doesn't feel right to use absolute positioning for layout. Usually you use this technique if you want to create responsive videos or any responsive iframe that has a certain aspect ratio. This technique is explained on CSS Tricks. I will share this article with you in the CodePen, and you can also find it on YouTube in the description. So I'm not going to use this. I want to try something else. We can't use percent, so let's try another relative unit. I will create another class. I'm going to call it square1. And I'm adding the border again. So instead of using percent, I will now try to use viewport units. Again, I'm defining a height. This time I'm using 50 VH instead of 50%. So the VH unit is relative to the viewport height. And I'm using the same value for the width. And this is what we get, a square. Perfect. Let's save it again and check it out in debug mode. And this works great. We have a square that's relative to the viewport height. This is awesome. But if the viewport width is smaller than the viewport height, we get overflow. And it makes sense because we are using the viewport height value for both width and height. And if the height is larger than the viewport, we get overflow. Of course, we could now use media queries and set breakpoints and define certain rules when to apply the width, but I believe there is a more elegant way to solve this. I'm going to save this if you want to check it out, and I'm creating another class here, square2. Instead of using VH, I can use vmin. One vmin is either one VW or one VH. It depends on which one is larger. So if the viewport height is larger than the viewport width, one vmin equals one VW. If the viewport width is larger than the viewport height, one vmin equals one VH. Let's try it. I'm going to change VH to vmin here, save it, and check it out in debug mode. And now nothing should change. It should look like before and behave like before. This works perfectly fine. The difference is now if the viewport width is smaller than the viewport height, we still get a rectangle because now one vmin equals one VW. If the width is larger than the height, one vmin equals one VH. And this is pretty much exactly what I want, because it doesn't matter how large the viewport is, we always get a perfect square. Awesome. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to center this square, so I'm going to select the body and the HTML element. I set the height to 100%. I select the body, set display to flex, justify content center and align item center. Great. Oops. Let's check it out one more time. Perfect. Square, always centered. We have some overflow here. This is because I set the body height to 100% and the body has a default margin of 8 pixels. So let's get rid of that as well. There's an interesting thing that I noticed. If we switch back to square number 1, so the one where I'm using VH instead of Vmin, you can see what happens if this square becomes a flex item. So as long as the viewport width is larger than the viewport height, it looks exactly like it did before. But if the viewport width is smaller than the viewport height, you can see that now we get this rectangle shape. It's not a square anymore. And this is happening because a flex item tries to fill its parent item. But if the flex item is larger than the parent, it shrinks. This is because the flex shrink property by default is set to 1. And this is interesting because on smaller screens, it makes sense to use a rectangle shape instead of a square shape. So I might use this instead of the Vmin solution. I don't know, we'll see. That's just something that's interesting to know. If you still want to use VH and you want to prevent your square from shrinking, you could just set the flex shrink property to 0. All right, the last thing I want to do, and now really the last thing, is I'm going to add some more content just to make sure that it works. So I'm going to add some dummy content. Let's change the class back to square 2. You can see that we have overflow here. That makes sense because the content is larger than the parent element. We can fix this by setting overflow to auto. And let's debug this one more time. Awesome. Always a perfect square shape, and we can scroll the content. Now, I would call it a day, but what I don't like about this is that I have to move the mouse inside the square in order to be able to scroll. What I really want is I want to be able to scroll anywhere in the viewport, like on any other website. So if my mouse is here, I want to scroll the content in the square. And this is quite difficult to implement, and I'm not going to do this now. I'm going to do this in the next video because there are a few things that we have to consider. That's it for today. I hope that you learned something new. Thank you so much for watching. If you have feedback or any questions, leave a comment on YouTube or contact me on Twitter or via email. And yeah, thanks again for watching. See you soon.